Well, he's the first Indian to become the dean of the prestigious Harvard Business School. Born in a small town in Rajasthan, it's been quite a journey for Nitin Nohria. Studied at I-I-T Bombay and then at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He went on to become the chairman of Crompton and Greaves in 2010, was appointed the dean of the Harvard Business School. Joining us this evening is the man himself, Nitin Nohria. Appreciate you joining us here on India Business Hour. Thanks very much for speaking to us here at CNBC TV 18. Let me start by asking you about your thoughts on the performance of the government so far. What's been your assessment of the tenure of the Modi administration? I know you were here in July. In fact, you conducted a leadership meeting at the Coal and the Power Ministry, speaking to bureaucrats and other officials. What's your own sense of how this government's performance has been?
So I think the good news is that the enthusiasm that people have for Mr. Modi's government and what it can mean for the future prospects of India remains very high. So sentiment is a very important thing in business, and I think that the most impressive thing is how much optimism remains, at least in my eyes, as I talk to business leaders here about the government. I think people are still patiently waiting for some of the changes that they hoped would occur to begin to translate into reality. My sense is that that patience will last for probably another year, and we need to see many more of the policies that the Prime Minister has announced translate into reality. Some of the early things that have happened, like the new coal auction and other kinds of ordinance-based laws that are being passed, give people confidence that at least some of the talk will get translated into action, and people want to see more of that. So all in all, I think it's still a very exciting and optimistic time for the country, and hopefully this optimism will sustain itself as more of the Prime Minister and the government's policies get translated into action.
All right, so you're saying that investors are willing to give the government another year to see a sustaining momentum as far as reforms are concerned. But you know, when you were here in July, Mr. Nohria, you spoke about India and China, and you said that investors are looking more favorably at India as opposed to China at this point in time. Financial services and the financial services sector, that's an area of vulnerability and concern as far as China is concerned. The government here very recently has been speaking about making reforms as far as the public sector banking services are concerned. We've seen them chart out a roadmap to reform the PSBs. Are we likely to see renewed investment commitment to India, especially in the financial services sector, given this government's intention?
So I certainly feel that there's a lot of reason for us to be optimistic about both foreign institutional investors as well as foreign direct investment increasing in India, particularly from the United States. By virtue of being Dean of Harvard Business School, I have the great privilege of meeting some of our alumni who run both financial services companies but also manufacturing companies around the world. And 2 years ago, to be honest, there was a period where in the course of a month I had felt very depressed. I'd had almost half a dozen people come to me and say that they were slowing down or thinking of withdrawing their interest in India. And just in the last, since this election, I've had many more people who have said now they feel a lot more enthusiastic, and those plans have come back to the front of their attention. So I think that if some of these policy changes that are currently being talked about get translated into action in the next year or two, we should see a fairly significant increase in the investment that American, both financial institutions as well as American manufacturing companies will make in India.
You just talked about American companies manufacturing in India. The government is trying to woo investors. Any specific sectors where you actually see manufacturing activity kickstarting and FDI coming in from America specifically?
So I think defense is, everybody believes that that is one of the biggest opportunities, and the great thing about defense is, as we find in the United States, is once you develop a defense-based manufacturing capability, it's an advanced manufacturing capability as opposed to a low-skill manufacturing capability. And once you do that, then you might imagine also investments will become more viable in places like electronics, particularly hardware, where India has seen very little FDI. So there may be sectors that are related to defense where we will start to see a boost. I also think that as the power sector increases and shows more life, there's a lot of manufacturing that supports the power sector, from power generation equipment to power transmission equipment to many other things in between. So I think that where the government makes a major commitment to both growth but also opening up the market for foreign direct investment, those might be the areas in which we see Make in India really take off. The only thing I would say is that beyond making a commitment to a sector, the government still has to do a lot to reduce the level of bureaucracy that people still experience when they think about manufacturing in India. So the number of permissions, permits, regulatory hurdles that people have to go through, and the petty corruption that is sometimes involved at every one of these stages, that still discourages some major companies from thinking about making in India. So that's an area where I would hope that, again, the Modi government, with its commitment to trying to make things simpler, India is ranked as amongst the worst countries in terms of ease of doing business. I think that's a dimension on which there will have to be considerable improvement if this Make in India campaign has to achieve its full potential.
Sure. Speaking of reforms, you know, the UPA tried to bring the foreign education bill, but nothing came of it. We don't know if the foreign university bill, we don't know if the government intends to take that forward or not. If that were to happen, how interested would you be at Harvard? Have you had any conversation with anyone in government about the possibility of that?
So I think that many international universities have learned that the idea of building campuses in other parts of the world is not as easy as it might first appear. It's very hard to build another campus in another part of the world and deliver the same quality that you can deliver at home. So our view at Harvard Business School is that our commitment is much more to help local institutions develop. We take great pride in the fact that IIM Ahmedabad, which we were involved at the early stages of their founding, celebrated 50 years. It's a remarkable institution. So we think that to the extent we can help local institutions by providing technology, by providing faculty relationships, by helping them do research, those are the ways in which we can let local institutions prosper. So I don't think that India's educational future depends so much on foreign direct investment in the education sector. I think it depends upon getting Indian institutions to become more prosperous, more successful. And in that regard, if international institutions can provide some support, can help in any way, we and many others, I'm sure, are ready to help.
Let me ask you a question on global growth and the recovery. The U.S. has recovered and it looks like the recovery is sustainable. What's your own sense about the strength of the U.S. recovery? And what are you hearing from global leaders about what's happening in other emerging markets as well as the Eurozone?
So I think, we should all be grateful, and I certainly feel very fortunate that the U.S. seems to have turned the corner and is on its path to growth. Again, the current oil price question raises some questions, because one of the big opportunities for the U.S. was to take advantage of shale and to continue to develop shale. At current prices, some people worry whether the U.S. recovery itself might falter because it doesn't make the development of shale sustainable. The vast majority of new shale in the U.S. is only sustainable at about $70 a barrel. So there's some concern about the U.S., but largely I think people are feeling very optimistic about the U.S. The challenge that we're going to have in Europe is that Europe, just as it was, I think, working its way out of the worst of its troubles, in some ways the oil crisis, which will hit Russia very badly, will cause some people to worry about what happens in Europe right now. So people are anxious about Europe. People are very optimistic, as I said, about India. There's some concern about China, which is, as the Chinese government seems relentlessly focused on reducing corruption in China, it looks like growth in China has slowed a little bit. But in the end, I think people still believe that China as an economy, and especially as it focuses itself on developing its own domestic economy as opposed to just being an export economy, will grow again. It'll be interesting to see. As part of my travels this year, I will find myself in Japan as well. I think if what Prime Minister Abe is doing causes Japan to grow again, that could be a huge boost to the global economy. But I think we're living in a moment where the brightest spot in the global economy is perhaps the US, followed by India. And people have some level of anxiety about every other part of the world right now. And hopefully that anxiety will quell and we can feel more optimistic about a global recovery, because it's been a long time. The financial crisis was 2008. We're starting 2015. I think the world needs to grow again.
Well, you said investors are excited about India. Well, what do you make of the startup scene here? We've seen several companies that have been incorporated in under a decade now, drawing some awe-inspiring valuations, especially in the e-commerce sector. How excited are you about the Indian startup scene?
I have to say that one of the most exciting things I've been following this time in India is the Flipkart and Amazon battle that is now seeming to unfold in the Indian retail economy. And you know, the last time I was here, I saw nobody sitting on an iPad ordering anything off any one of these companies. And this time I've been surprised. I've been going to people's houses and I've been seeing them on their iPads or on their computers ordering goods and comparing prices in terms of what's available on Flipkart, what's available on Amazon. So it's really quite heartening to see that there's a real Indian entrepreneurial company that is giving Amazon a good run for their money. And in some ways, I've always believed that rivalry is one of the best things that can happen in business. So I hope that this rivalry between Flipkart and Amazon will inspire many other Indian entrepreneurs to realize that they too can compete in these ways against these global giants. And we're seeing what happened in China, where clearly Chinese internet companies from Baidu to Alibaba and many more in between have demonstrated that they can be very, very successful companies in their domestic economies because they understand something about the peculiarities of the local market that sometimes multinationals cannot. I think for the first time there is reason to believe that India might actually create some significant major domestic internet-oriented companies that will come out of entrepreneurial ventures here. So it's an exciting time.
All right, Nitin Nohria, that's what's exciting you. Thanks very much for joining us.